When you think of Beetlejuice, you probably think of the Tim Burton classic. You think of Michael Keaton's incredible career-defining performance as the titular character. You think of the accompanying music and how inappropriate it was for the movie that it was in, and yet how perfectly it fit that gothic atmosphere. But what is often not brought up, or just outright forgotten, is the short-lived animated series. Yes, there was an animated series. This is less a follow-up to the first film, and more of a complete reimagining, as many shows based on movies were at the time. It shares some of the same atmosphere and aesthetic as the original, but it's really doing its own thing with it. The background music for the show often sounds like sound-alikes to the soundtrack of the movie, and when it doesn't, its accompanying music sounds like something that belongs in that movie. The visuals very often do feel like they're from the imagination of Tim Burton, at least in terms of setting and architecture. The background looks like a gothic fever dream, so it's kind of perfect in that sense. The show also does reuse and recycle some sets from the source material from time to time. It also recreates moments from the movie, albeit usually with a different context. And sometimes, they just straight up recreate scenes verbatim. But when it comes to the actual character models, the show starts to resemble a much more sanitized, real monsters. Which isn't necessarily a complaint, because if I'm being honest, it works some of the time. But at other times, it does come off a little too cartoony for a Beetlejuice cartoon. As odd of a sentence as that may sound. While the show showcases a lot of the same characters from the movie, they changed the dynamics of these characters, with Lydia's parents being pushed so far into the background that they hardly ever make an impression. They're not as involved in the show as they were in the movie, but they do attempt to be more involved with their daughter's life. There are less people here and more silhouettes. I wouldn't call them characters because they're really designed just to be obstacles or MacGuffins for our main characters, those being Beetlejuice and Lydia, who are no longer adversaries, but instead the best of buds. It's a weird change to make for sure, but it's one that works for this retelling. The two go from being at odds to being an odd couple, but they both do benefit from this friendship. Beetlejuice gets Lydia to embrace her own nature, and Lydia desperately tries and usually ultimately fails at grounding Beetlejuice. It's an interesting change seeing Beetlejuice try to use his hellish powers for good. And it's somewhat endearing to see him have as close to a healthy relationship with someone as he will ever be capable of having. Though it can get a little uncomfortable when his friendship sees him enamored with this girl, having a shrine dedicated to her in his mind, and even becoming insanely jealous when she has romantic interests. Keep in mind that Lydia is definitely aged down in this series compared to how she was in the movie, and I think in the movie she was a teenager. Look, it was weird when they did that in the movie and she was so young, but it's even weirder here. Worst off is that the movie was aware of the absurdity of the situation, whereas here it's not played for being bizarre, it just is, though it is only an occasional fixture of the show. Luckily, these awkward moments are far and few between, aside from Beetlejuice often referring to her as Babs. But you can look past that because that doesn't mean anything, necessarily. Being that this was a low-budget cartoon based on an already established big brand, none of the original cast returned to their roles. In place of Michael Keaton was a sound-alike actor, Stephen O'Met, and he does a pretty good job all things considered. Like the show itself, I find that this performance takes the original as a blueprint, but builds on it differently. It sounds like Michael Keaton's performance, but it doesn't sound like someone doing a straight-up impersonation of it. The actor makes it his own, but still keeps the character identifiable. This still does feel like Beetlejuice, just viewed under a different lens.
You hate him, right? I hate him myself! Hey, you know me, babe. I love to party.
For some reason, I've had this lifelong Mandela effect, where I could have sworn that Bobcat Goldthwait was playing Beetlejuice in this.
Oh, nice bike! Where do you put the batteries?
Lydia is now played by Allison Court, who kinda just does her own thing with the part. Aside from the cartoon's appearance feeling inspired by the original on-screen character, not much else makes her feel like that same character. This is a much lighter take on Lydia, which I guess makes sense for the series. I mean, you can make the same comment for the titular character and any other returning roles that they have here, but I don't think as much of a character gets lost in translation as this one. In the end, the character ends up feeling a lot more generic than her non-cartoon counterpart. She's your standard bland character, just with a different aesthetic. I kinda wish the part was played a little closer to the character from the movies, but as a performance on its own, it's fine. The character is endearing and entertaining when she needs to be. It just doesn't feel like Winona Ryder. But Lydia and Beetlejuice are not the only returning characters here, as the show also recycles the shrunken head ghost from the movie, and even those sandworms that Beetlejuice hates oh so much. They're all over the place here, though he does wind up unwillingly befriending one of them. Amongst the many differences between the movie and the animated series, the one that stands out the most to me is that the movie mostly takes place in the real world, while getting a glimpse into the netherworld, whereas in the show, it showcases the netherworld every chance it gets, and only takes place in the real world when reality warping is involved. It has no desire for the mundane or ordinary, and you know what? I kinda love it for that. They also introduced some interesting new side characters into the mythos, showcasing Beetlejuice's community, filled with wacky, ghoulish neighbors, like Ginger the tap-dancing spider, whose name is really the only description you need, and Jacques Laline, who is a late bodybuilder that spends all his time working out muscles that he literally no longer has. Though one of the most interesting additions to the lore is Prince Vincent, who is undoubtedly a callback to Tim Burton's famous stop-motion short titled Vincent. The only reason I was able to decipher this is because I've watched that short way too many times as a kid. I had an anniversary DVD of Nightmare Before Christmas, and on the special features of one of those DVDs was the short Vincent and I think the original Frankenweenie. There might have been other stuff, but those are the two that stick out to me the most. I remember watching them all the time. So seeing the character Vincent from that short, or I guess more accurately, a character who is Vincent adjacent, the characters are similar in more than just name and appearance, as the two are shown to be over-the-top dark dramatic types. Although to be fair, maybe the similarities between the two could be due to their shared resemblance to the Beetlejuice creator. The show isn't without its issues. As a matter of fact, at times, there's an abundance of them. It can be a rough watch some of the time. First and foremost, the show was clearly made on a budget. It feels kinda cheap. There's a couple of obvious animation errors that you just kinda gotta look past, and some of the choices in animation and aesthetic are questionable, to say the least. There's some audio issues as well, which, I'm willing to forgive and look past because it happens to the best of us, right? In all seriousness, sometimes the dialogue doesn't sync up well with the characters' mouth movements, which I think is somewhat forgivable given the time period. But what's far less forgivable is that there are plenty of cases in this show when a voice is not only ear-grating, but completely unintelligible. I get that you're doing monster voices, but when your voice sounds so monstrous that you cannot enunciate, maybe dial it back just a little bit. It doesn't feel like a fixture of the show, it feels like a flaw of it. Even outside of that, the background music doesn't always fit the situation it's attached to. Like, sometimes distractingly so. Out of every episode, I think the pilot is symbolic of all of these problems, and they don't persist as the series go on. There's less and less of them episode by episode. That first impression it's gotta be the worst impression. This has to be the most random show I've ever watched. The best way I can describe it is by saying things happen. Things are definitely happening, but I'm not exactly sure what it is that's happening, or why it is happening. Even plots to episodes seem unclear sometimes. It's like the narrative has ADD and can't decide what it wants to do next. So it just does all of it. On one hand, it benefits the show because you truly never know what to expect and you don't know what's going to happen next. It is never uneventful or boring or predictable. Unfortunately, at times, it also isn't coherent because of it. The humor in the show is hit or miss. It's not always funny, but it is always funny. I'm just going to give you a highlight reel from the first few episodes so you see what it is I'm talking about.
I'll tell you, babes. I'm beside myself.
Ugh! Beetlejuice, pull yourself together.
All right.
Then I wouldn't get so hung up on it.
Don't you want to get even? Yow! Talk about raining on my parade. What's wrong, babes?
That happens all the time. At some point, you just feel like there was a mandatory rule made that every scene has to end with a punchline, emphasis on pun. I stand by every complaint I've made. They're all relatively valid. I find that what this show lacks in execution, it makes up for with an abundance of creative concept. It's always doing something different. It's always trying something new. And sure, it doesn't always stick the landing, but it's at least always trying. I appreciate the efforts that are put in here, even if they don't always turn out the greatest results. And to be fair, sometimes they do. It's a real 50-50 situation. The show is never short on creativity. Beetlejuice does start to suffer from Superman syndrome. You know, when a character can suddenly just do everything and anything. If you think it, they could do it. Get us into storylines and out of jams at the snap of your fingers. And this would probably bother me on almost any other show. But this really isn't that kind of show. These aren't high-stakes situations or deep, meaningful plots. They're goofy fun that's fueled entirely by imagination. Seriously, it's really unique. No two plots are ever alike, and the show never stops being innovative. Even the little things it does, like having Beetlejuice throw his voice by having him literally throw his own voice, I just love. Even if they never explain why when people show up in television sets, they look like an Angela Anaconda nightmare, I don't mind it. Like I said before, they're always doing something different, putting their own unique spin on the mythos. If Beetlejuice the Animated Series is guilty of anything, it's being shamelessly experimental. And I will say, for all the complaints that I've lobbied against the show, I found that the season I watched improved with time, with almost each episode feeling better than the last. It's funny because I was actually kinda disappointed when I first started rewatching this, but by the end of the first season, the show had won me over completely. It wasn't perfect, but it was entertaining despite its imperfections. Even the opening to the show is worth sitting through. I think if you're a fan of this property, then this is must-see. And once again, I'm only talking about Season 1 here today. But if you'd be interested in seeing me cover the remaining 3 seasons, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Fine, nobody say Beetlejuice.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.
It started off as a movie. Eventually, you know, we got the cartoon, which was still good too.
The cartoon was good.
It was a different vibe of the movie, but it was still enjoyable.